Complete Summary of Misery by Stephen King. First published June 8, 1987. Warning, spoilers ahead. Read to you at Book Nook. The story begins with Paul Sheldon, a successful author of the Misery series, regaining consciousness after a car accident on a remote Colorado road during a snowstorm. Paul feels disoriented and experiences excruciating pain in his legs. He discovers he has been rescued by Annie Wilkes, a former nurse and his self-proclaimed #1 fan. Annie has taken him to her isolated farmhouse rather than a hospital, claiming that the storm has made travel impossible. As Paul fades in and out of consciousness, Annie administers pain medication, which he later identifies as Novril, a strong and addictive narcotic. Annie reveals that she has been caring for Paul since the accident and has been using her nursing skills to treat his injuries, including multiple fractures in his legs. Paul is initially grateful but soon becomes uneasy about Annie's behavior. Her demeanor swings unpredictably between kind and menacing. She insists on being called Misery's #1 fan, referencing Paul's famous romance series centered on the character Misery Chastain. Paul privately resents the series, having considered it a commercial venture rather than serious literature. He had recently written a new manuscript, a departure from the Misery books, and plans to pivot his career. Annie's obsession with Paul and his work becomes more evident as she brings out her cherished collection of Misery novels, which she has read repeatedly. She gushes about her love for the character and expresses how much Paul's work has meant to her. She asks to read his latest manuscript, a crime thriller titled Fast Cars. Despite his hesitation, Paul agrees, hoping to placate her. However, Annie reacts violently after reading the manuscript, berating Paul for the profanity and filth in the story. She declares it unworthy of his talent and accuses him of betraying his fans. She slams the manuscript against the wall, leaving Paul frightened but physically powerless to intervene. Paul begins to realize the depth of Annie's instability when she expresses a bizarre mix of maternal affection and authoritarian control. She forces him to rely on her completely, administering his medication, feeding him, and controlling his environment. Despite her erratic behavior, Annie assures Paul she will nurse him back to health, though she makes no indication of when, or if, she plans to take him to a hospital. Paul begins to feel trapped, recognizing that his survival hinges on managing Annie's volatile moods. Annie eagerly purchases the final book in the Misery series, Misery's Child, which has just been released. Paul dreads her reaction, knowing that he deliberately killed off Misery Chastain in the book to bring the series to an end. Annie reads the novel voraciously, and her reaction is as explosive as Paul feared. She storms into his room in a blind rage, accusing Paul of betraying her and Misery's legacy. She declares that Misery did not deserve to die and blames Paul personally for the character's demise. In a terrifying moment, Annie forces Paul to acknowledge her feelings of betrayal. She punishes him by withholding his medication, leaving him in unbearable pain. Annie eventually calms down, but her demeanor remains unpredictable. She demands that Paul fix what he has done to Misery by writing a new novel in which the character is resurrected. She brings him an antique typewriter and reams of paper, insisting he begin immediately. Annie enforces strict rules, including the use of a specific type of paper and forbidding the use of profanity in the text. Paul recognizes that his life depends on complying with her demands and begins to craft a story that will satisfy her expectations. Despite his outward compliance, Paul secretly plots his escape. He notices that Annie leaves the house for errands, providing brief windows of opportunity to explore his surroundings. Using these moments, Paul discovers the extent of his physical limitations and the challenges of navigating the house in a wheelchair. He also uncovers disturbing evidence of Annie's dark past, including a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths during her career as a nurse. Paul realizes that Annie is likely a serial killer who has gotten away with multiple crimes. As Paul continues writing the new Misery novel, Misery's Return, he employs his skills as an author to craft a story that will captivate Annie. He carefully integrates elements he knows she will love, using this as a strategy to keep her appeased. Meanwhile, he becomes increasingly desperate to escape, testing the limits of his physical strength and devising plans to outwit Annie. The psychological battle between Paul and Annie intensifies, with Paul striving to maintain his sanity and Annie growing more possessive and controlling. Paul's resourcefulness becomes increasingly evident as he devises plans to escape. He begins hoarding small items he finds around the house, such as paper clips and bobby pins, experimenting with ways to unlock doors or disable restraints. One of his most daring acts occurs when he manages to steal a small knife from the kitchen. He hides it in his mattress, knowing it could serve as a weapon or tool in a critical moment. Paul also begins to build his physical strength, despite the limitations imposed by his injuries. He practices moving in his wheelchair and manipulating objects with precision, preparing himself for the possibility of a confrontation with Annie. Annie's behavior takes an even darker turn when she enters one of her depressive episodes. She disappears for days, leaving Paul alone and without access to food or medication. Paul experiences intense hunger and withdrawal symptoms, forcing him to confront the fragility of his situation. When Annie finally returns, she is disheveled and erratic, mumbling about her own inadequacies and failures. Paul realizes that Annie's depressive states make her more dangerous, as her self-loathing could lead to unpredictable and violent actions. One of the most harrowing moments occurs when Annie discovers that Paul has been exploring the house during her absences. Furious at his betrayal, she drags him out of his room and forces him to witness the extent of her cruelty. Annie demonstrates her power by using a sledgehammer to hobble Paul, smashing his already injured legs to ensure he cannot escape again. The pain is excruciating, and Paul realizes that Annie's capacity for violence knows no bounds. Despite this setback, Paul's resolve to survive remains unshaken. He vows to outlast Annie's torment and find a way to escape, no matter the cost. Paul pours himself into the final chapters of Misery's Return, using the act of writing as both a distraction and a weapon. He carefully crafts a climactic ending designed to elicit a powerful emotional response from Annie, hoping to manipulate her in her most vulnerable moment. Meanwhile, he continues his secret preparations for escape. Despite his physical limitations, Paul devises a plan to turn the tables on Annie. He sharpens his wits and gathers whatever tools he can find, knowing that the final confrontation will require both cunning and courage. Paul completes Misery's Return, and Annie is ecstatic, declaring it her favorite novel and gushing over how he has brought Misery Chastain back to life. She plans a celebratory ritual to mark the completion of the book, insisting on a symbolic burning of the manuscript. Annie tells Paul this will be their final act together, which Paul interprets as a clear signal that she intends to kill him afterward. Her excitement contrasts sharply with Paul's inner turmoil as he prepares for what he knows will be his last chance to escape. Annie prepares the scene for the ceremony with almost religious fervor. She decorates the room with candles and insists that Paul be dressed in clean clothes. She carefully arranges the manuscript on a table and brings in the materials for the burning, including matches and lighter fluid. Annie's obsessive attention to detail unnerves Paul, but he hides his fear and pretends to go along with her plan. He thanks her for her help in making the novel a success, knowing his flattery will keep her placated long enough for him to execute his plan. Paul has spent days strategizing for this moment. He deliberately altered the manuscript Annie is about to burn, ensuring that the pages are filled with meaningless text rather than the actual story. He has also hidden a can of lighter fluid, which he plans to use as a weapon. When the moment arrives, Annie hands Paul a match and insists that he light the manuscript on fire himself. Pretending to comply, Paul picks up the match, strikes it, and ignites the edge of the paper. As Annie leans forward, enraptured by the flames, Paul seizes the can of lighter fluid and hurls it at her face, causing the flames to flare and engulf her in confusion. Annie screams and staggers back, momentarily blinded by the fire and disoriented by Paul's sudden defiance. Taking advantage of the chaos, Paul grabs the heavy typewriter he has been using to write the novel and smashes it down on Annie's head with all the strength he can muster. Annie crumples to the floor but is not incapacitated. Instead, she lets out a guttural scream and lunges at Paul with a knife she had hidden nearby. Paul, despite his broken legs and weakened state, fights back with ferocity, using his wheelchair to block her attacks and striking her repeatedly with whatever objects he can grab. The room descends into chaos as they grapple, with Paul using his wits and survival instinct to counter Annie's raw strength and unrelenting rage. The struggle is brutal and prolonged. Annie's sheer physical power makes her a formidable opponent, but Paul's desperation and cunning give him an edge. At one point, Annie pins Paul to the floor and tries to strangle him, but he manages to reach for a heavy object, a ceramic figure, and smashes it into her face. This stuns Annie long enough for Paul to pull himself up and gain the upper hand. Believing he has finally subdued her, Paul drags himself toward the door, crawling on his hands and knees, his body screaming with pain. Just as he is about to escape, Annie reappears, bloodied but alive, wielding an axe. She charges at Paul with a primal scream, determined to kill him. In a final act of defiance, Paul grabs a metal rod from the fireplace and strikes Annie with a precise blow to her temple, sending her crashing to the floor. This time, she does not get up. Paul, drenched in sweat and barely conscious, ensures that Annie is truly dead by checking her pulse and observing her lifeless body. His relief is overwhelming, but his ordeal is not over. Exhausted and bleeding, Paul uses the last of his strength to crawl out of the house and onto the porch, where he collapses. Moments later, he is discovered by a rescue team that had been searching for him. They rush him to a hospital, bringing his months-long nightmare to an end. Paul is found in a state of extreme physical and emotional exhaustion. His rescue is both a relief and a bittersweet moment, as he is finally freed from Annie's clutches but deeply traumatized by the months of captivity and violence he endured. As Paul begins to rebuild his life, he reflects on the impact of his experience. He finds himself grappling with conflicting emotions, relief at having survived, guilt over the compromises he made, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. Despite his physical limitations, Paul returns to writing, using the ordeal as inspiration for a new novel. The act of writing becomes both a catharsis and a way to reclaim his identity, allowing him to process the horrors he endured and channel them into his work. In the end, Paul emerges from his ordeal as a changed man. Though he carries the scars of his captivity, both physical and emotional, he finds solace in the act of creation and the resilience of the human spirit. Annie Wilkes is gone, but her shadow lingers in Paul's mind, a reminder of the darkness he faced and overcame. The story closes with Paul taking the first steps toward healing, determined to move forward while never forgetting the lessons he learned in the depths of his struggle. The end. I hope you have enjoyed this summary. If you liked it, please subscribe so I can keep uploading even more books. Also, giving me a like helps a lot. Finally, if you would like me to summarize any specific book, please write me it in the comments.